Welcome to this trip through one of Georgia's most disturbing cases ever. Please leave a comment below telling me where you're watching from and when you're listening to this narration. We want to know where and when these documented accounts happen, both during the day and at night. In the summer of 1836, the damp heat of Savannah stuck to everything. Willow Creek Plantation was on the Savannah River, about 15 miles upstream from the busy port city. The property wasn't one of the biggest in Chatham County, but it stood out because it was so far away from other homes. The main house was on a gentle rise that gave it a great view of the fields and the river beyond. It was located where a small tributary fed into the main river and was partially hidden by a thick grove of live oaks draped with Spanish moss. County records from 1835 show that after her husband Jonathan Blackwood died, Mrs. Ella Blackwood became the only owner of the plantation. The paperwork shows that Mr. Blackwood died from what doctors at the time called a wasting disease of the lungs. He left behind a widow and 3 daughters, as well as a lot of debt. What happened in the year after his death would eventually lead to what the Savannah Daily Republican would later call a most troubling matter that decent society dare not discuss openly. After Mr. Blackwood died, neighbors didn't come by Willow Creek very often. The Harrison family owned the closest plantation, which was about 4 miles downriver. Later, Miss Margaret Harrison told a county official that the Blackwood place had become so heavy that you could feel it when you crossed the property line. She said she only went to see Mrs. Blackwood twice after the funeral. She said Mrs. Blackwood had changed, and where there used to be warmth, there was now coldness. Local church records said that the Blackwood daughters, Catherine, Elizabeth, and Mary, who were 23, 20, and 18 years old, were well-mannered and well-educated young women. Catherine, the oldest, was known for being smart and good at running things. She helped her father with plantation accounts when she was very young. People said that Elizabeth was very beautiful and that many men wanted to marry her. Mary, the youngest, was remembered by her old teacher as quiet and observant, and she had a strange love of studying plants. This case is especially disturbing because the Blackwood plantation seemed to run normally in the months after Jonathan Blackwood died. Tax records from late 1835 show that the plantation was actually more productive during this time, even though it lost its leader. This economic recovery would later become a key issue in the investigation that followed. In February 1836, Mrs. Blackwood made a business choice that people at the time thought was strange. Records from the Savannah Mercantile Exchange show that she sold about 30 acres of land that produced cotton so she could buy 3 more enslaved men from a trader in Charleston. Local planters were shocked by the deal because the men were said to be top-notch field hands with strong bodies and were paid much more than the market price. Also, the plantation's current workers were thought to be enough for the smaller area. In April 1836, a river merchant named Samuel Wilson wrote about a strange encounter in his business ledger. This was the first sign that something was wrong at Willow Creek. Wilson, who ran a small trading ship between Savannah and Augusta, said he stopped at Willow Creek to sell supplies. He said that Catherine, not Mrs. Blackwood, met him. Catherine was very professional and cold for her age. Wilson noticed that the house seemed to be unusually busy, with the sounds of construction coming from the back of the property. When he asked Catherine what the work was, she allegedly said they were improving accommodations for those who contribute most to our recovery. Wilson also mentioned something that would later be important to investigators. I could hear women talking from the upper floor of the house, but I couldn't see the younger Mrs. Blackwood anywhere. When I politely asked how they were doing, Miss Catherine told me with unusual firmness that her sisters were busy with important tasks that needed to be done to protect our family name. By the beginning of summer, the other plantations in the area started to notice that the Blackwood daughters weren't going to church or social events anymore. Mrs. Harrison said that she visited the family in June and only saw Mrs. Blackwood for a short time in the front parlor. Ella looked different, thinner, and had a hardness about her eyes that I hadn't seen before, according to what she told the police the next year. When I asked about the girls, she said they were busy with family matters that were sensitive, and then changed the subject to the price of cotton. Mrs. Harrison also said that while she was there, she saw through a window one of the newly acquired enslaved men being led by Catherine to what looked like a newly built outbuilding behind the main house. Mrs. Blackwood reportedly got in the way very quickly when she tried to get a better look at the building by moving to another window. She suggested that they have tea in the front room, away from the heat of the afternoon sun. In late July, Willow Creek called for Dr. Thomas Green, the doctor who had seen Jonathan Blackwood when he was sick. His medical journal, which was found during the investigation that followed, says that he found Elizabeth Blackwood to be very pregnant when he got there. Dr. Green's private notes say that what bothered him was not the pregnancy itself, which, while scandalous for an unmarried woman of her standing, was not unheard of, but rather the clinical way that Mrs. Blackwood talked about the situation. Dr. Green wrote, "Mrs. B spoke of the matter as one might discuss a prize mare's foaling. When I inquired as to the father, thinking perhaps arrangements for a hasty marriage might be in order, she dismissed the question as irrelevant to the task at hand. Most troubling was Miss Elizabeth herself, who sat silently throughout, showing neither shame nor any other emotion one might expect. She appeared sedated, though I observed no evidence of laudanum or similar substances." The doctor's notes continue. "Before departing, I was asked to examine the youngest daughter as well, finding her also in a family way, though less advanced. When I expressed concern, suggesting that perhaps the young women might benefit from a period of rest with relatives in Charleston, Mrs. B fixed me with a gaze I shall not soon forget, stating, 'Doctor, what you witness is the salvation of Willow Creek. We have discovered a resource more valuable than cotton.'" It looks like Dr. Green told Reverend James Harlow of St. John's Episcopal Church in Savannah about his worries. There is a mysterious note in church records from the 3rd of August, 1836, that says Reverend Harlow planned to go to Willow Creek to deal with issues of great moral importance. The planned visit never happened, though, because the Reverend had to go to Virginia to take care of his sick mother. The wider community didn't know much about what was going on at Willow Creek until the 12th of September, 1836, when an enslaved man named Solomon escaped the plantation and went to Savannah. Solomon fled to First African Baptist Church, where he told Reverend Marshall, one of the few black ministers allowed to preach at the time, what had happened. Church records that survived a fire in 1858 say that Solomon told the Reverend about things that were going on at Willow Creek that were too disturbing for him to write down completely. What is known is that Solomon talked about a new purpose that Mrs. Blackwood had brought to the plantation. He talked about building a separate building behind the main house with rooms for the Blackwood daughters. According to Solomon's testimony, Mrs. Blackwood had come up with a plan to make valuable assets through selective breeding. The remaining parts of Solomon's story suggest that Mrs. Blackwood saw a chance to make a lot of money in the domestic slave trade. Instead of just growing cotton, she had decided that breeding enslaved people, especially those with lighter skin who would be classified as house servants, would give her a much better return on her investment. The scary implication was that she was using her own daughters in this plan. Solomon said that Catherine, the oldest daughter, didn't want to help her mother at first, but she was eventually convinced or forced to do so. Elizabeth and Mary were basically locked up in the new building, where they had to be around the enslaved men that Mrs. Blackwood had bought for this purpose. On the 15th of September, 1836, Savannah officials sent Sheriff William Parker and 4 deputies to investigate Willow Creek Plantation based on Solomon's testimony. The official report from September 16th says that they found an outbuilding that matched Solomon's description. They found Elizabeth Blackwood in labor, with only her mother and sister Catherine there to help her. Mary was kept in a different room because she was very pregnant. The scene before us defied all expectations of civilized conduct, the sheriff's report says. The building, which was surprisingly solid, had 4 rooms arranged around a central corridor. 2 rooms seemed to be designed to hold the young women, with sparse but adequate furnishings. A 3rd room had 3 pallets where it seemed the enslaved men were kept. The 4th room had been fitted as a crude birthing chamber, containing a bed, water basins, and various implements. When the police talked to Mrs. Blackwood, she reportedly showed no remorse or shame. Deputy James Foster's sworn statement says that she defended what she did as a reasonable way to meet her financial needs. She supposedly told Sheriff Parker, "Cotton depletes the soil, requiring ever more land, but people replicate themselves and increase in value. The mathematics is irrefutable." The most disturbing evidence came from a ledger book that Catherine had. The Georgia Historical Society now keeps the book, which carefully listed breeding pairs, expected delivery dates, and the estimated values of the children that would be born. Notes said that lighter-skinned kids could be sold as house servants for a lot more money, especially in New Orleans. The ledger also had calculations on how long the Blackwood daughters could work, saying that each could have between 8 and 12 children that could be sold before they died. During the raid on the plantation by the authorities, Elizabeth gave birth to a son. Medical records say that both she and the baby lived through the birth, but Elizabeth was said to be in a state of deep detachment. Mary gave birth to a daughter about 3 weeks later while she was in jail in Savannah. The case was never tried in public. According to historical records, Judge Howell Cobb of the Superior Court of Chatham County ordered the proceedings to be kept secret for the sake of public morality and the reputations of some well-known families who were married to the accused, Mrs. Blackwood and Catherine were quietly sent to the Georgia State Lunatic, Idiot, and Epileptic Asylum in Milledgeville. Records show that they stayed there until they died in 1842 and 1861, respectively. Elizabeth and Mary, along with their kids, were sent to live with relatives in Boston who lived far away. Records from churches in Massachusetts show that the sisters were eventually put in different homes and may have changed their names. There is no more historical evidence of them. The county sold Willow Creek Plantation to pay off debts. Reports say that the new owners tore down the outbuilding right after they bought it. People in the area say that they set fire to the building and buried the ashes. In October 1836, the enslaved people of Willow Creek, including the men who were part of Mrs. Blackwood's plan, were sold at auction. A Quaker merchant from Pennsylvania bought Solomon, whose testimony brought the case to light. The merchant then freed him. There are no records of Solomon's later life, but there is a man who looks like him in the 1850 census records for Philadelphia. Before 1963, this case was mostly unknown outside of some historical and academic circles. That year, historian Dr. Margaret Wilson found the sealed court records while looking into plantation economies before the Civil War. Dr. Wilson's next paper, Economic Desperation and Moral Degradation, the Willow Creek Incident, was sent to the Southern Historical Review, but was turned down because it was too provocative. The manuscript was stored at Emory University, but never made public. In 1968, while workers were building a housing development along the Savannah River, they found foundations that matched the descriptions of Willow Creek Plantation. Archaeologists found a smaller building behind the main house's foundation that had metal restraints built into the walls that were still standing. The find was briefly reported in local papers before the developer filled in the area and work on the building started again. The story of the widow of Savannah is one of the darkest parts of Georgia's history, not just because of the horrible things that were done, but also because of how coldly they were planned and carried out. It shows how slavery and economic pressures could ruin not only social systems, but also the most basic human relationships. The methodical way that Mrs. Blackwood's plan works is probably the most disturbing thing about it. The ledger entries do not indicate a descent into madness. Rather, they reflect a calculated business strategy, perceiving her daughters and the enslaved individuals under her authority as mere production units within a human supply chain. This case compels us to confront disquieting inquiries regarding the distortion of moral boundaries within economic systems and the pervasive commodification of individuals, which transcends the evident frameworks of chattel slavery, to undermine even the ostensibly sacred ties of family. There is no marker or memorial today that shows where Willow Creek Plantation is. The land has been split up and built on, and most of the people who live there now don't know what happened there almost 200 years ago. But in archives and historical records, the documentation is a stark reminder of how dark human nature can be when people are seen as nothing more than goods. We don't know what will happen to the kids who were born at Willow Creek. There are no records that show whether they stayed with Elizabeth and Mary or were moved somewhere else. The lack of information about this in history may be the only mercy in this otherwise cruel story. The case of the widow of Savannah serves as a disturbing reminder to those who study the darkest parts of American history that the most horrible monsters are not supernatural beings, but regular people who, when pushed or persuaded, can convince themselves that the unthinkable is not only possible, but necessary. Some people who live near the old plantation site have said that they hear strange sounds on summer nights, which they say are women's voices carried on the evening breeze. Historians and psychologists say that this is probably the power of suggestion at work, since the story has come up in local lore from time to time. People who say they heard these sounds, on the other hand, say they are very disturbing. They are not cries of pain or fear, but the cold, methodical tone of someone counting things. A graduate student named Thomas Jenkins said he found a small, leather-bound book while doing research at the Georgia Historical Society in 1967, a year before the archaeological discovery of the foundation. Jenkins said that the book had what looked like Catherine Blackwood's personal diary in it, which was different from the business ledger that had been found before. Jenkins said that the diary showed how Catherine first reacted with horror to her mother's proposal, then slowly accepted it, and finally enthusiastically agreed to take part. Jenkins said that the diary disappeared from his research materials before he could properly write about it or take pictures of it. The Historical Society's catalog doesn't have any records of such a diary, and Jenkins' story is mostly seen as either made up or confused with another document. The Blackwood case is still one of the most disturbing examples of how slavery ruined not only the people who made money from it, but also whole family systems and moral frameworks. The horrible but logical end of a system that turned people into property and breeding stock is what happened at Willow Creek Plantation. It looks like the name Blackwood has been systematically erased from Savannah society. There are no streets or buildings named after it, and genealogical records of well-known Savannah families don't seem to show any links to the Blackwood line. This erasure shows that the community wants to distance itself from the horror and see it as an isolated event rather than a sign of the larger system that allowed it to happen. Riverside Estates is a suburban development that now covers the land where Willow Creek used to be. People who live there sometimes say that the air feels unusually heavy, especially near where archaeological evidence suggests the outbuilding used to be. Records show that one lot has changed hands 7 times since 1970, which is a lot more often than other lots in the area. The most troubling part of the Widow of Savannah's story may not be what we know, but what we don't know. Things that are buried in sealed records, lost documents, and collective silence. The legacy of such planned cruelty is still part of the landscape, like the foundations of Willow Creek Plantation, which are hidden but still there. It is felt but not seen, acknowledged but not spoken. And somewhere, maybe the methodical calculations of Elalina Blackwood still ring out, reminding us that the ability to do horrible things is not found in supernatural forces, but in the way people can make sense of the unthinkable in order to stay alive, make money, or gain power. The sounds of the river keep flowing past the old site of Willow Creek Plantation, taking secrets with them to the ocean. But some secrets never go away completely. They just sink into the ground, becoming part of the ground where new buildings are built and new lives are lived, not knowing what is below. In 1964, Rebecca Collins, a local historian, tried to find Solomon's descendants. He was the man whose testimony had revealed the terrible things that happened at Willow Creek. Her research took her to Philadelphia, where she found records of a free black man named Solomon Blackwood, who started a small carpentry business in the city in the 1852. Census records showed that he had 3 kids and was involved in groups that wanted to end slavery. Collins wrote in a research journal that the last name Blackwood was strange for a former slave to take on, since they usually wanted to stay away from their former owners. She thought that Solomon might have chosen the name on purpose, either as a way to take back what was lost or as a permanent reminder of what had happened. Collins was able to find Solomon's family tree all the way back to a great-granddaughter named Esther Johnson, who lived in Pittsburgh in 1964. Collins' notes say that she set up a meeting with Johnson, who had a collection of family papers that had been passed down through the years. One of the papers was a handwritten account that Solomon is said to have written in 1852 about his time at Willow Creek Plantation. Collins was allowed to take pictures of the account, but not take it away. It gave more information about what life was like at Willow Creek in the months after Jonathan Blackwood's death. Solomon said that Mrs. Blackwood had gathered the slaves in the yard a week after the funeral and told them that things would be different from then on. He remembered her saying, "We can no longer afford the luxury of sentiment. Each of you is an investment that must pay off. Solomon's story told how Catherine Blackwood slowly changed from being a reluctant participant to her mother's most devoted enforcer. He wrote, "Miss Catherine, who once showed kindness when her father was still alive, adopted a manner so cold and calculating that it chilled more deeply than her mother's cruelty." While the mistress spoke of necessity, Miss Catherine began to speak of efficiency and improvement, as though we were machinery to be optimized instead of souls in bondage. Most disturbing was Solomon's description of overhearing a conversation between mother and daughter while he worked on building the outbuilding that would later house the breeding operation. He said that Catherine had first said no to getting her sisters involved, and instead suggested that they get suitable women from the market. Mrs. Blackwood is said to have said, "The market value of the resulting offspring depends entirely on their appearance and qualities. Our line has education, refinement, and the features that command premium prices. Your sister's participation is not up for discussion. It is the cornerstone of our recovery." Collins said that Johnson didn't want to talk about some parts of her great-grandfather's story, especially the parts that talked about the physical and mental ways that the Blackwood daughters and the enslaved men who were forced to take part in the scheme were kept in line. Johnson is said to have told Collins, "Some parts of our history are not meant to be examined too closely. They cast shadows that can darken the present." Collins wrote an article based on her research and sent it to the Journal of Southern History in 1966. Editorial correspondence in her personal papers shows that the article was turned down for publication. The editor wrote, "While your scholarship appears sound, the subject matter and certain graphic elements make this unsuitable for our readership. Also, without access to the primary document for other scholars to check, the account's authenticity is still in doubt." Collins passed away in 1969, with most of her research not being published. The University of Georgia's archives got her papers as a gift, but they weren't cataloged until 1982. At that point, she couldn't find Esther Johnson again, and the Solomon Blackwood account has never been verified by anyone else. In 1972, while the Chatham County Courthouse was being remodeled, workers found a sealed metal box inside a wall. There were a lot of papers from the 1,830 seconds in the box, including a partial transcript of Elizabeth Blackwood's testimony during the investigation of Willow Creek Plantation. The transcript, which is now kept in the Georgia State Archives, shows how Elizabeth saw the events. However, historians disagree on whether her statement shows what she really thought or if it was affected by her mental state and possibly coaching from her mother. Elizabeth said, "Mother explained that our situation had become desperate. Father had borrowed extensively against future harvests, and his illness had prevented proper management of the plantation. Upon his death, we discovered the extent of our predicament. We faced not merely reduced circumstances, but complete ruin." The transcript continues, "Mother gathered us in Father's study and presented her calculations. The breeding and sale of one healthy child would equal the profit from 10 acres of cotton without the attendant costs of seed, equipment, and seasonal labor. Furthermore, the initial investment would multiply naturally over time." She spoke of it as our patriotic duty, ensuring the continuation of our way of life by adapting to changed circumstances. Most disturbing was Elizabeth's description of her own gradual acceptance. At first, the suggestion seemed beyond contemplation, but Mother reminded us of what awaited genteel women without means: serving as governesses or companions, if fortunate, falling into true poverty and disgrace, if not. She asked if we preferred momentary discomfort or lifelong destitution. When presented in such terms, the logic became difficult to resist. The transcript includes Elizabeth's description of how Catherine initially resisted their mother's plan most strongly, threatening to expose the scheme to authorities. Elizabeth said, "Mother didn't yell or threaten. She just took Catherine to the study and showed her the ledgers, the debts, and the projections. They came out 3 hours later, and Catherine's mood had completely changed. She started right away to figure out output, redesign the quarters, and choose possible subjects from among our property. The document ends here. The rest is either lost or was purposely taken out before the box was sealed in the wall." The partial transcript raised as many questions as it answered, particularly regarding the psychological methods Mrs. Blackwood employed to convince her daughters to participate in such a scheme. In 1975, psychiatrist Dr. Robert Simmons published an analysis of the Willow Creek case in the Journal of Historical Psychology titled Coercive Control and Familial Compliance: The Blackwood Women of Willow Creek. Simmons proposed that Mrs. Blackwood had employed techniques similar to those observed in cult indoctrination or prisoner conditioning: isolation, creation of existential threat, logical but morally distorted arguments, and gradual normalization of the unthinkable. Simmons wrote, "The available evidence suggests that Mrs. Blackwood did not employ physical force or even direct threats against her daughters." Catherine's conversion from strongest opponent to chief enabler represents a classic case of what we now term identification with the aggressor, a psychological defense mechanism whereby a victim adopts the perspective and values of their oppressor as a means of managing otherwise unbearable anxiety. The Simmons analysis further suggested that the spatial organization of Willow Creek Plantation, particularly the construction of the separate breeding facility, served both practical and psychological purposes. Instead, she made a closed mental space where her suggested solution, no matter how horrible, seemed like the only reasonable thing to do. He wrote, "Mrs. Blackwood created both literal and metaphorical distance between normal plantation life and the breeding program. This compartmentalization would have facilitated the psychological splitting necessary for the participants to maintain some sense of propriety, even as they engaged in activities that violated every social and moral code of their society." A local fisherman found what looked like the remains of a small dock or landing stage about half a mile downstream from the old Willow Creek site in 1978, when a severe drought caused the Savannah River to drop to historically low levels. Later, amateur historians looked into this and thought it might have been a private shipping point built by the Blackwoods. They might have used it to secretly move enslaved people born on the plantation without going through the Savannah port, which was more closely watched. This discovery supported one of the more disturbing parts of the case. Catherine's ledger suggested that the Blackwoods had made connections with slave traders who worked outside of the usual channels, specifically those who supplied markets in New Orleans where light-skinned enslaved people could get top dollar for household service. People knew that these traders were very dishonest. They often sold free black people who had been kidnapped from northern states, as well as people who were legally enslaved. The fact that this private landing may have existed suggests that the Willow Creek operation may have lasted longer than the official record says. It may have been going on for months before Solomon's escape brought it to the attention of the authorities. It also makes you wonder how many kids may have been born and sold through this channel before the scheme was found out. Dr. Julia Martinez, a literary scholar, found what could be a reference to the Willow Creek case in the private letters of author William Faulkner in 1981. In a letter to fellow writer Sherwood Anderson from 1931, Faulkner wrote about hearing a particularly disturbing story about antebellum depravity while visiting Savannah. The story was about a widow who turned her own daughters into breeding stock. Faulkner said that the story plumbed depths of human corruption beyond what even I might convincingly render in fiction, and he also said that some parts of the story later affected how he wrote the character Thomas Sutpen. In his book Absalom, during renovations at the old Georgia State Lunatic, Idiot, and Epileptic Asylum, which had been renamed Central State Hospital by then, a set of patient records that had been walled up during earlier construction were found. One of these was a more complete file on Elena Blackwood, which included treatment notes that were not in the official archives. Dr. James Wilson, the doctor who was there, said that Mrs. Blackwood was entirely lucid and rational in all matters not pertaining to her crime. He said that she kept saying until her death that her actions were completely justified by economic necessity. Wilson's notes say that Mrs. Blackwood told him, "In time, sir, my methods will be vindicated. The institution itself remains unchallenged. I merely applied its principles within the family unit, rather than maintaining artificial separation. The objection is not to what was done, but to who did it and where." What scared Wilson the most was that Mrs. Blackwood spent a lot of her time in the asylum making calculations and projections in notebooks that she had asked for. These writings were taken away often, but always replaced. They had detailed studies of how her breeding program could have grown and improved if it had kept going. Wilson wrote, "She seems to think that her imprisonment is only a temporary setback. She talks a lot about when I return to operations, even though she has been told that she will be in prison for the rest of her life." Typhoid fever spread through the asylum and killed Ella Lenana Blackwood in 1842. The hospital's death register says that no family members came to get her body, so she was buried in an unmarked grave on the asylum grounds. Catherine Blackwood lived until 1861, when she died of what records call a wasting illness of the lungs. This was the same illness that killed her father and started the whole tragedy. Catherine's psychological trajectory is significantly divergent from that of her mother, as evidenced by her patient records. Ella Lenana never changed her mind about what she did, but Catherine is said to have had a major mental breakdown about 5 years into her imprisonment. Asylum records show that she got more and more upset, refusing to eat, and tearing her own clothes and hair. She eventually calmed down and was almost catatonic, only responding to simple commands and not talking much. One of the few things she said during this time was after a visit from a local minister in 1854. The visitor's log says that Catherine suddenly broke her silence to ask, "Are they thriving?" When the minister asked who she meant, she said, "The children, my sister's children, my nieces and nephews, and my mother's goods." She went back to being quiet and didn't say anything for several months. The fate of Elizabeth and Mary Blackwood and their kids is still one of the most moving parts of the case. Historical records show that they were first sent to live with Blackwood relatives in Massachusetts who lived far away. After 1840, however, their trail goes cold. There are no marriage records for either sister under their birth names, which suggests that they may have changed their names, either on their own to get away from the shame of their past or because their host families forced them to. Church charity records from Boston show that 2 young women who fit the descriptions, along with young children of mixed race, got help from a Presbyterian Women's Aid Society in 1839. The women were referred to as Southern refugees of formerly good family, now reduced to unfortunate circumstances. The record indicates that they were aided in their relocation to the Western Territories, yet it lacks details about their destination or subsequent fate. Wilson wrote in notes, found among her papers after she died in 1988, "The deliberate erasure of these women and their children from historical record represents a secondary violence, an attempt to excise not just the crime, but its victims from collective memory." The Widow's Calculation, a historical novel loosely based on the Willow Creek case, came out in 1969. Sarah Johnson, the author, said that she wrote her story based on family papers from an ancestor who was a deputy in Chatham County in the 1832. Historian Margaret Wilson wrote an unpublished paper about the case in 1963 that got the attention of other historians. In the last years of her career, she tried to find the Blackwood sisters and their children by looking through records from the frontier. People said the book made the case sound more exciting than it really was and changed a lot of the known facts, but it was the first time that the Willow Creek incident was told to a wider audience. Johnson's book had a made-up ending that suggested that the children born at Willow Creek had unknowingly become part of important Southern families. This was an invisible legacy of Mrs. Blackwood's scheme. This part seems to be completely made up, but it got people interested in the real case again and led to more academic research in the 1970 seconds. In 1992, while building the Riverside Estate subdivision near the old Willow Creek site, construction workers found a small cemetery with about 15 graves. Archaeological study showed that the graves were from the early to mid-19th century and were likely those of enslaved people because there were no coffins and there were burial goods that were typical of African American funerals at the time. One of the graves had the body of a woman in her early 22s, and it looked like she was buried with a baby. The analysis of the remains showed that both had died around the same time, probably during or shortly after giving birth. The woman's bones showed signs of a healed fracture to the right radius from when she was a child, which is typical of a defensive injury. This discovery made it possible that not all of the births at Willow Creek had resulted in viable merchandise for Mrs. Blackwood's scheme, and that the human cost of her program had been even higher than what had been reported before. The remains were finally buried again with the proper ceremony at a memorial site set up by local community groups and descendants of enslaved people from the Savannah area. Finally, in 2004, the Georgia Historical Society put up a small historical marker near the old entrance to Willow Creek Plantation. The text on the marker says that extreme abuses of the slave system occurred at the site, but it doesn't say what those abuses were. Local historians wanted the language to be clearer, but they agreed to use less clear language in order to get some kind of public recognition. Since it was put up, the marker has been vandalized several times. It has been defaced, taken down completely, and even found hanging from a tree nearby. It has been restored or replaced many times, and each time it has become a place of ongoing tension between people who think that history should be made public and those who would rather it stay hidden. In 2008, researchers from the University of Georgia's Department of Genetics started a project that asked people in Savannah whose families had lived there since before the Civil War to send in DNA samples for analysis. The goal was to look at how genetic diversity and mixing happen in the people who live in the area. The researchers recognized that the project could possibly uncover genetic lineages associated with the Blackwood family, although it was not explicitly centered on the Willow Creek case. The results, published in 2011, indicated that approximately 3% of the samples submitted showed genetic markers consistent with descent from the Blackwood lineage, including both white and African American participants. The authors of the study said, "These findings suggest that the reproductive exploitation that occurred at sites like Willow Creek has left a genetic legacy that persists in the regional population, often unknown to the individuals carrying these markers. This genetic evidence may be the most solid proof that some children born of the Willow Creek breeding program did survive and reproduce. Their descendants are now spread out across the regional population and beyond, carrying a biological link to a history they may not even know about." Today, the story of the widow of Savannah is a disturbing footnote in the history of American slavery. It reminds us that the horrors of slavery went beyond physical violence to include psychological manipulation and family corruption that still puzzle us. It represents an extreme manifestation of the commodification of human beings that was fundamental to the slave system, taken to its logical but horrifying conclusion within the context of a family presumably bound by ties of affection and moral obligation. The case raises uncomfortable questions about how economic pressures can warp human relationships and values, particularly in societies already structured around fundamental inequalities. Elenina Blackwood's coldly rational approach to her family's financial crisis, treating her daughters as productive assets rather than as human beings deserving protection, represents a grotesque extension of the same logic that allowed the institution of slavery to exist at all. The most troubling thing about the historical record is that it suggests that Mrs. Blackwood didn't think she had broken the moral code of her society. Rather, she appears to have viewed her innovation as merely a more efficient application of principles already embedded in that code: the right of ownership over human beings, the prioritization of economic considerations over human dignity, and the treatment of reproduction as a managed resource rather than a sacred aspect of human experience. As one approaches the site today, little visual evidence remains of what once occurred there. The river continues to flow, carrying its secrets. The houses of Riverside Estates stand on manicured lawns, their residents going about their daily lives. The historical marker, when not vandalized, offers only the briefest acknowledgement that something significant and terrible once happened in this place. But for those who know the story, the land itself seems to have a certain heaviness. It's not the supernatural fear of ghost stories, but something deeper, the weight of history that hasn't been resolved, of justice that hasn't really been served, and of wounds that have been inflicted not just on people, but on the idea of human dignity and family ties. Margaret Wilson, a historian whose work brought this case to light despite institutional resistance, said, "The horror of Willow Creek lies not in ghostly manifestations or supernatural visitations, but in the entirely human capacity to reconstruct moral frameworks to justify the unthinkable when under sufficient pressure. Mrs. Blackwood was not a monster in the traditional sense, which is precisely what makes her actions so deeply disturbing. She was merely a human being who, when faced with economic ruin, recalculated the value of her daughter's humanity and found it wanting." Solomon, the man whose bravery brought the horror to light, may have the last word on the widow of Savannah. In the end of his supposed written account found among his descendants' papers, he wrote, "Some ask why I took the name Blackwood when granted my freedom, the name of those who committed such evil. I carry it not in honor, but as testimony. As long as a Blackwood walks this earth, the truth of what happened on those quiet riverbanks cannot be entirely erased. I bear witness with every signature, every introduction, every time my name is called. The river may wash away blood, but it cannot cleanse memory." And so the story of Willow Creek Plantation remains, not as a lurid tale of supernatural horror, but as a stark reminder of the darkness that can emerge from the human heart when people are valued as commodities rather than as bearers of inherent dignity and worth. The real horror isn't what is strange to us, but what is all too human. The ability to justify the unthinkable in order to survive, gain status, or make money. The legacy of the widow of Savannah lives on, not in ghostly forms or cursed ground, but in the fight to make sure that people are never again treated like entries in a ledger, entries in a breeding program, or resources to be optimized. It reminds us that the most important fight against horror is not fought with crosses or silver bullets, but with the constant, vigilant insistence on seeing the humanity in everyone, especially when economic, social, or political pressures try to make us do something else. As the sun sets over the Savannah River and casts long shadows over what was once Willow Creek Plantation, one might picture Elenina Blackwood still figuring things out, still making things better, and still sure of her own logic. And perhaps the most important lesson from this dark history is that the most dangerous monsters are not those that stalk the night, but those that walk among us in the light of day, with ledgers in hand, sure that what they are doing is right and necessary. It's scary that these things happened a long time ago. What's even scarier is that the reasons behind them are still clear today, putting profit ahead of people, economic need ahead of human dignity, and planned efficiency ahead of compassion. The story of the widow of Savannah is more than just a historical oddity. It is a warning that has been passed down through the years like whispers on the river breeze. Beware the monster that wears the face of rational necessity.